Hi all, it's Pastor Chris from St. Stephen. We just finished up the second session of our five session Bible study called Our Suffering. The first one was about grief. You can go back and watch that video if you want, where I kind of break down what we talked about last week. So this week we're talking about lament. So the definition of lament that I use is twofold. First, we touched on that it's a tool to get through the grieving process, right? So it's a tool to get through the grieving process. As you are dealing with loss and are having all kinds of responses to that, one way you can move to another stage in the grieving process is by practicing lament. Now, second definition of lament, a time when you can say exactly what you mean. Now, of course, we're in New Jersey where everybody does that anyway, right? No, I'm kidding. So a time when you can say exactly what you mean, that you can really say, no, this is the way in which I am suffering right now, and that's acceptable. That is something that is seen as part of the larger process of getting over a loss, or if not getting over, at least engaging with it in a way that furthers your mental, physical, and spiritual health. So, a time when you can say exactly what you mean, and a lot of this has to do with pointing blame, and in the biblical traditions, oftentimes pointing at God in one way or another. That's something, pointing at God and pointing at what suffering really looks like. So you can name suffering in a atrocious way. You can really say, yeah, no, this is the problem here, that the local crematorium is 2 weeks behind schedule because there's so many people dying of COVID-19. That's laying it out there in a real way. That is lamenting. That's not being polite about things, but just calling a thing a thing. So, one of the places we find lament is in the Psalms. In fact, lament psalms are a actual genre in the Bible. In fact, 40% of psalms are lament psalms. So it's the most common genre we find in the Psalms, in the songbook of the Bible. So, with genre, of course, comes structure. What is it that it looks like to when you have a psalm that is a lament psalm? So you start off with naming God, and then naming a need. It can be small, it can be large. Most of them are large in the Psalms. Then asking for help and explaining what's in it for God. Usually it's, well, God, if you respond to my plight, I will praise you, that kind of thing. And then, or alternatively, enemies will not see you as a weak God. Enemies will not think they've won, stuff like that. And usually it ends up with an offer to give God praise. And then finally, and very abruptly, I might add, there's the praise itself. So you name God, you ask for help and explain why it's worthwhile to help you. And then it goes straight to praise. And going from that second part to the third part, as I said, goes really quickly. It's abrupt. And some people think that's because these psalms are always written with 20/20 hindsight. They're written in retrospect. So they're testimonies to God's goodness. So they start off, I've been through this bad situation. I ended up getting through it. I ended up on the other side, and God is still faithful, and I recognize God got me through it. And so once you've had that experience, then you go back and you write about it. And alternatively, another way to think about it is also that there's just a well of hope in God's people that allows us to go straight to praise even in the midst of our sufferings. So two different ways to think about that. We're going to look very briefly at Psalm 13, just to think about what a or not to think about, to listen to what a lament psalm sounds like. How long will you forget me, Lord? Forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long will I be left at my wit's end, agonizing, having agony fill my heart? Daily? How long will my enemy keep defeating me? Look at me. Answer me, Lord my God. Restore sight to my eyes. Otherwise, I will sleep the sleep of death, and my enemies will say, I won. My foes will rejoice over my downfall. But I have trusted in your faithful love. My heart will rejoice in your salvation. Yes, I will sing to the Lord because he has done good to me. So all those basic things are all there. So naming God and naming a need, right? That, hey, Lord, you've forgotten me. By the way, it feels like you've forgotten me. That's a need. Will you help me out here? Will you look to me? Will you remember me? Oh, Lord. Will you look to me? Will you answer me? Oh, Lord. Because if you don't, the alternative is that my enemies will say, I won. They will rejoice over my downfall. So those are the consequences if God doesn't act. And then finally, go straight to praise. I've trusted your loving faithfulness. I rejoice in your salvation. I sing to the Lord because he has done good for me. Right? Goes really quickly to praise. And as I said, that's either because God's people are able to move from sorrow to praise quickly, and I've definitely seen that happen in people's life. But also I've seen just as often, if not more often, times we have people who've been through some stuff, and they're able to talk to you about having went through that stuff and how they've got through and what the other side looks like, and that hopefully will in turn help you in the midst of your sufferings. So, for that matter, there are laments in the New Testament, not as many as we find in the book of Psalms, but the big one is Psalm 22, that psalm that I wail out every Maundy, Thursday. It's that psalm that Jesus says, points to, quotes from the cross. My God, why have you forgotten me? Why have you left me alone? Why are you so far from saving me? So far from my anguish and my groaning? So it goes all the way through that there's these variety of things that are afflictions. Everything from the bulls of Bashan surrounding me, lions causing my heart to turn to wax and my bones falling apart, and me becoming like a worm, packs of lions around me again. We got all kinds of bad stuff. My strength dries up. I need to be delivered from a sword. People have abandoned me. The congregation itself is in trouble. And then it switches to, I will declare your name in the congregation. I will revere you, O Lord. I offer praise. I will fulfill my promise. So again, getting to the, here's why it's worthwhile to help me out here, O Lord. And then finally, by the end of it, it's this powerful point of joy that, of course, we can think about our Lord on the cross moving to this point that as he's saying, my God, why have you forgotten me? Why have you forsaken me? He also knows his psalms and is pointing to the end as well, pointing towards a good ending, a resurrection. Indeed, all the earth's powerful will worship him. All who are descending to the dust will kneel before him. My being also lives for him. Future descendants will serve him. Generations to come will be told about my Lord. They will proclaim God's righteousness to those not yet born, telling them what God has done. That you end up with this U-shaped slingshotting back, and that whole thing is there, but, being completely honest about it. Jesus is also going through this great loss, the loss of his very life, that God's only Son dies. That is a tragic loss for all who knew him, all who experienced the healing and the teaching. The least, the last, and the lost, all of them are now at a space where they lose him who has been with them and would not abandon them. And so they too go through this whole process as they process that psalm. So, additionally, Mark 14:36, we have Jesus at Gethsemane asking God to take away this cup from me. That there's one of the Gospels even goes so far as to have Jesus weeping blood. Then we also have John 11, verse 35, which I talked about last week, that Jesus goes and sees Lazarus dead, and he too laments there. He cries. It's the shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept. So, there is lament as well in the New Testament. So it's not just something consigned to the old if people are acting like Marcionites and trying to banish the whole of the testimony of God from what it means to be God's people. That, hey, you can't do that. It's also in the New Testament. Lament is a whole cloth piece of Scripture. Then we get to the big book. So that was the smaller examples, but then we have a whole book of lament, the book of Lamentations. Or if you translate the first couple of words more literally, the book of how. How can this happen? How long? These kind of question marks that float in the air when we're lamenting, when we're in the midst of grief, when we are faced with loss. How, O Lord? Now, the book of How, the book of Lamentations, is structured in a kind of funny way. It's an acrostic poem. Well, 4 out of the 5 chapters are acrostics, so that means that they go from A to Z, or Aleph to Tau in this case. Now, some people would say that that's a way to remember, A through Z. You remember the first part of the poem, so you remember the whole thing. That's part of it, possibly. That you want to be able to remember this whole poem of tragedy. But I think, and this is just sort of me talking here, I think what's going on is that they are going for the idea that they are naming the whole swath of tragedy, what it is like to be in Jerusalem at the end when it has been destroyed. When you yourself are a person seeking refuge of any sort, that there's a whole swath of sorrows, and they are naming them A to Z. Then also there is the secondary structure here, that it is a chiastic structure. So an A, B, C, B, A structure. So that means chapter 1 and chapter 5 kind of thematically fit together, and so do chapters 2 and 4, which means, of course, chapter 3 is a special chapter. It's the center of it. In fact, usually when these type of things happen, that you have an atypical chapter or a chapter in the center of a chiasm, they're kind of the super important chapters. So in this case, we can assume that chapter 3 and chapter 5 are especially important. So this is likely written shortly after the temple is destroyed. But more than that, because it's not just the temple that's destroyed. Because we have to remember the multifaceted tragedy of the year 586, when the Babylonians take out all the basic parts of what it means to be from Judah. So on one hand, Temple destroyed. The center of religious life destroyed. Jerusalem itself destroyed, the space that is the footstool of God. The dynasty of David, the kingship that is supposed to always be on the throne, is destroyed. And then finally, the nation of Judah itself, the nation that has a direct covenant with God, a direct agreement, a treaty with God. All those are pulled out from underneath the folk, the people of God there. And I would venture to say the majority of the Old Testament, the majority of Hebrew Scripture, is a wrestling with all of these certainties coming unstuck in a tragic and terrific way. So all those sure promises of God are swept away. So how do you still remain faithful? What does it mean? How do you handle such a tragedy? And one of the ways you do it is lament. So with that, I'm going to walk us through very, very quickly the 5 chapters of the book of Lamentation, the book of How. So, just starting us off. How she sits alone, the city once great with people. She has become like a widow, great among nations, mistress among provinces, reduced to forced labor. She weeps on through the night, and her tears are on her cheek. She has no consoler, for all her lovers, all her friends have betrayed her. Have become enemies to her. Judah is exiled in affliction and in hard labor. She dwells among the nations. She finds no rest. All her pursuits overtake her in straits. All her pursuers, The roads of Zion mourn with the festive pilgrims. All her gates are desolate. Her priests are groaning. Her virgins are sorrow-stricken, and it is bitter for her. Her foes are at the head. Her enemies are tranquil. For the Lord has stricken her with sorrow because of all her trespasses. Her babies have fallen captive before the throne, and from Zion's daughters is departed all her glory. Her nobles have become like stags. They find no pasture. They go without strength before the pursuers. Jerusalem recalls in the days of her affliction and her wandering all her treasures that were in the days of yore, when she when her people fell to the foes' hands with none to help her. The foes saw her and they laughed over her distress. I could go on, but this multifaceted image of, first we see a woman, then we see a woman who we recognize as she's the city itself, and yet she's also a person in the city, and therefore both she and the city are now a widow, are like a widow. Great once they were among nations, but now reduced to forced labor. For that matter, her lovers, these other nations that were once around her, that have in fact perhaps entrapped her in unfaithfulness, have become her enemies. So there's this ongoing metaphor of Jerusalem as a woman, but also, this woman in Jerusalem is the model for Jerusalem itself. There's this interesting back and forth there. Then fast forwarding to chapter 19, verses 19 to 22. I call out my lovers, they deceive me. My priests and elders perished in the city when they sought food that would revive their failing lives. See, O Lord, for I am distressed. My innards are roiled, my heart churns within me, for I have surely rebelled. Outside, the sword slays sons, inside, very death. They have heard that I groan, I have none to console me. All my enemies heard of my harm, were gladdened. But it was you who did it. You brought this day, you summoned. May they be like me. Let all their evil come before you, and do to them as you did to me. For all my trespasses, for my groans are are many, and my heart aches. So just to touch on that briefly, we have all these physical things happening in the person's body, which we definitely experience in times of grief. You know, that's why we call heartache, because you physically feel it. So too, the innards are roiling, bubble, 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 the heart's churning. But then also, the most astonishing of verses is verse 21. All my enemies heard of my harm and were gladdened. But it was you who did it. It's blaming God for all of this, putting it on God's wide shoulders and recognizing that suffering and God have something connected together. And one of the interesting things that happened during our conversation today was that none of us could bring ourselves to consider that possibility in a sort of sustainable, ongoing way, that that the love of God seems to trump the potential for the wrath of God. Of course, there's other people who look at this pandemic and say, well, you know, at a certain point, we had, you know, the great fires everywhere, we have this pandemic, now we have murder hornets, there's going to be a massive snowstorm. Perhaps we need to let God's people go, wherever they happen to be, right? Anyway, that's a side note, and I could get off on a particular tangent there, but I'll try to keep on here. So anyway, just the idea that God is active in the suffering is something that is astonishing. And if it's not astonishing to you, take a little more time and think about it, perhaps. So moving to chapter 2, the day of the Lord's wrath. No. Looking at verse 6 of chapter 2. And he stripped bare his shelter like a garden, laid it ruin, his appointed place. The Lord wiped out the memory in Zion of festivals and Sabbaths. Oh my goodness, so the holy time has been eliminated. And spurned in his raging wrath kings and priests. Again, two figures that have divine inspiration and right, that are again knocked away by God. The master abandoned his altar, cast aside his sanctuary, so the temple itself, the citadel walls as well, so the space in which people are supposed to be safe from all their enemies because God has stuck a good king in place. For that matter, in verse 9 we get to her king and her nobles were among the nations. There was no teaching, so no law. Her prophets, too, were not vouchsafed, visioned from the Lord. So the law and the prophets even are going kaput. Right? This is some big stuff. All that to say just that these holy things are being hamstrung by God. And that's, again, an astonishing claim. Looking forward, verses 18 through 22, the big point here is that the author saying, consider the life of your children, that they're going to faint from famine. And in fact, in verse 20, you're going to practice cannibalism. You're going to eat your kids, because that's what happens when war and famine strike nations, when your city has been sacked. And again, this is just a horrific thing. And as whenever we go through a tragic time, it is important to look to our children as well and just check in on them and make sure that in any way you can, that you can keep them from some of the suffering, not with false promises by any means, but just consider their feelings, because sometimes in the midst of our own lament, we forget the kiddos. So chapter 3 introduces a new character, the man of affliction, who is struck by the wrath of God's rod. He's driven away, led off into darkness without light. He wastes away in his bones. He's walled away. His prayers are blocked. A lurking bear is with him. A lion is hiding with him. He is driven into, he has arrows driven into his innards. So things are just going pretty rough for this human being. But it's chapter 3, so this becomes the center point. So what's going on here? Looking forward to chapter 16 and onwards, he continues to have horrible things. He is eating gravel and squishing and breaking his teeth on it, and he's being crushed into the dust. And yet, he recalls in the midst of his afflictions and wandering, he remembers, he recalls that he has hope. The Lord's kindness has not ended. His mercy is not exhausted. They are renewed every morning. Great is God's faithfulness. Great is your faithfulness. My portion is the Lord, I said. Therefore I yet hope for him. That even in the midst of all that, the height of this lament, the center of this poem, this chiastic structure, is pointing here that there is hope. So it's as if we're going up this mountain of suffering, and somewhere at the peak of it, we have this moment of vision and of hope and of kindness and greatness. Then, of course, we start walking back down the mountain, and the end of chapter 3 ends up again saying, well, Lord, grant me justice, and in fact, go after my enemies. So again, go back to hurting those who've hurt me, those who have cursed me, you should curse. Then when we get to chapter 4, we again think of the children. And in this example, the children are like gold and gems and heavily weighted gold, and yet they've turned into pots that can be easily broken. Oh my goodness, have we forgotten somehow that the children are in fact the most precious thing here, and they are being treated as slaughtered cattle? And similarly, to the end of chapter 3, the end of chapter 4 ends with a request that God would slaughter the Edomites. And it's said to be that in the midst of the capture by Babylon, the Edomites swung in and stole things from the temple. But I think there's also maybe a bit of a psychological thing going on here that, you can't beat up on the Babylonians. They're our captors, and they're the big dog in town. But at least the small dog that's yapping at us, we can push back, and we can ask for their destruction. So sometimes if you can't deal with the main problem you're dealing with, you fixate on the smaller problem that might actually be manageable. There we go, psychologizing a psalmist there. But looking then finally at chapter 5, again, we're going down the mountain. So at this point, we're going back to describing the destruction, the desolate nature of Zion, of Jerusalem and the surrounding area. So looking at the very end of it, verses 15 through 22. Our heart's joy is no more, our dancing has turned to mourning, the crown of our head has fallen, woe to us, for we have all offended. For this our heart is anguished, for these our eyes go dark. O Mount Zion, that is desolation, foxes go out. But you, O Lord, for all time are enthroned, your throne for all generations. So remember, even with the Psalms, it eventually heads to this U-shaped surprise of praising God. So we finally reach this place, this second height, along with the height of chapter 3. As I said, chapter 3 being the center of things, and chapter 5 not being a acrostic, means those two are going to be categorically different than the other ones. And here we go. Your throne for all generations. Why should you forget us forever, forsake us for endless years? Bring us back to you, Lord, that we come back. Renew our days as of old, for indeed you have rejected us. You have been grievously furious with us. So there's, again, this is a back and forth, and yet there's praise in there, even as there's also great sorrow. So all that to say, If you ever feel like it might be impious to grumble at God a little, to name in a very clear way the feelings of loss you might have, remember that 40% of the Psalms is loss, is naming and moving through loss. For that matter, the New Testament contains points of great sorrow as well, and the book of Lamentation, the book of How, asks that very question that we ourselves ask so frequently when confronted with loss. How? How does this happen? How is God not helping me in this moment? How did we end up here? So that concludes the second session about our suffering as we look at lament. Blessings, and see you all next week. Bye.